They said Duke Adrian Blackthorne's heart died the night his fiancée did. They were wrong. It had died long before that, the night he learned what his family truly was. The estate sprawled across the hillside like a corpse dressed in silk, all marble columns and manicured lawns hiding the rot underneath. Inside the grand ballroom, 200 nobles pretended not to stare at the man standing alone by the window, a glass of untouched wine in his hand and murder in his eyes. Adrian Blackthorne had mastered the art of being both present and absent. He stood 6 feet 2 inches of controlled violence wrapped in a perfectly tailored coat, dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if it ever bothered to express anything human. At 32, he'd already buried a fiancée, destroyed 3 political rivals, and earned a reputation that made grown men choose their words carefully in his presence. Tonight, he wished they'd all just shut the hell up. Lady Pemberton's summer gala was the kind of obligatory nightmare Adrian had learned to endure with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything else. Smile. Nod. Let them whisper about the cold duke who never remarried. Let them speculate about what really happened to Catherine all those years ago. Their theories were all wrong anyway, and the truth would only disappoint them. Through the crowd, he caught sight of Lord Cedric Ashbourne holding court near the champagne fountain, golden hair gleaming under the chandelier light, like some kind of angel cosplaying as a snake. Cedric's laugh carried across the ballroom. Bright, charming, everything Adrian had never bothered to be. Everything Adrian's father had wanted him to become. His jaw tightened. The wineglass stem creaked under his grip. Cedric noticed. Of course he did. The bastard noticed everything. He excused himself from his admirers and glided over with that insufferable smile still plastered on his face. You know what's fascinating about predators? They always recognize each other. Adrian had learned that lesson young, watching his father work, understanding that power wasn't about strength. It was about knowing exactly where to apply pressure until something broke. Cedric was good, but Adrian's father had been better. And Adrian? Adrian had been a very attentive student. Blackthorne. Cedric's voice was warm honey over broken glass. Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd sworn off society after that unfortunate business with the Thornfield contract. Adrian took a slow sip of wine he had no intention of drinking. Disappointed I'm still breathing, Ashbourne? Not at all. Where would I find entertainment without you lurking in corners like some gothic novel reject? The insult was lazy. Cedric was testing, looking for cracks. Adrian had spent 15 years making sure there weren't any. Your concern for my social calendar is touching, Adrian said. Almost as touching as your recent acquisition of the Marlow shipping routes. I hear you paid quite generously for access to those docks. Cedric's smile didn't slip, but something shifted behind his eyes. Business is business, Your Grace. Surely you understand that better than anyone. I understand that those routes belonged to merchant families for 3 generations until someone started buying up their debts. Families who suddenly found themselves bankrupt and desperate enough to sell to the first nobleman who offered relief. You're accusing me of what exactly? Being a savvy investor? Adrian set his wine glass on a passing servant's tray with deliberate care. I'm accusing you of being predictable. My father used the same tactic in the grain markets 20 years ago. Bought low, sold high, and left a trail of ruined lives behind him. Of course, he had the good sense to make it look like coincidence. The temperature between them dropped 10 degrees. Around them, conversations continued, oblivious. This was how it always worked. Polite words covering the kind of warfare that left no blood but plenty of bodies. Cedric leaned in slightly, voice dropping. Your father was a great man, Adrian. It's a shame you've spent so much energy running from his shadow instead of stepping into it. There it was. The real thrust. Not an insult, a recruitment pitch. Adrian had been hearing variations of it since he turned 18. Join us. Use your name. Your father understood how the world really works. You could have everything he had. What they never said out loud. You could be just as monstrous as he was, and we'd all be better off for it. My father, Adrian said quietly, was a cancer in expensive clothing. If you're hoping I'll follow his example, you're going to die disappointed. Cedric's mask slipped for just a moment. Beneath the charm was something colder, sharper. You think you're different? You think refusing to play the game makes you noble? You're still here, Blackthorn, still attending parties, still maintaining your position, still benefiting from everything your family built. The only difference between us is I'm honest about what I am. He wasn't wrong. That was the thing that kept Adrian awake most nights. The knowledge that every brick in Blackthorn Manor, every acre of land, every ounce of power tied to his name had been purchased with someone else's suffering. His father had been thorough, efficient, and utterly without remorse. Adrian had inherited all of it, the estate, the fortune, the reputation, and the consequences. Before he could respond, Lady Pemberton appeared in a rustle of silk and strategic ignorance. Lord Ashbourne, the ambassador from Eldermere is asking for you. Something about the trade negotiations? Cedric's smile snapped back into place like a weapon being sheathed. Duty calls. Do think about what I said, Blackthorn. The game doesn't stop just because you refuse to play. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving Adrian alone with the sharp-eyed hostess who'd definitely interrupted on purpose. That man is poison, Lady Pemberton said conversationally, but you already knew that. Everyone here is poison, Margaret. Some of us are just more diluted than others. She laughed, actually laughed, which was why Adrian tolerated her more than most. Margaret Pemberton had been married 3 times, buried all 3 husbands under mysterious circumstances, and somehow maintained enough social standing to make her parties unmissable. She was proof that the right kind of scandal could be currency if you were shameless enough about it. I heard you're hiring artists, she said. Something about restoring the gardens? Word traveled fast in this world. Adrian made a non-committal sound. The girl I recommended arrives tomorrow, Margaret continued. Evelyn Vale. Young, brilliant, absolutely no connections to high society whatsoever. She'll be perfect for whatever brooding project you're planning. I'm not brooding, I'm allocating resources to historic preservation. Darling, you were born brooding. Your mother probably looked at newborn you and thought, this child needs therapy and a better lighting scheme. Despite himself, Adrian's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Margaret noticed, of course, and looked unreasonably pleased with herself. The gardens have been dying for years, he said. Someone should do something about it. It was the closest he'd come to admitting that the Moonlit garden at the heart of his estate, the one place his father had forbidden everyone from entering, had become something of an obsession. 3 months ago, he'd finally walked past the iron gates he'd avoided since childhood. What he'd found there had been beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Hidden pathways, locked statues, and buried beneath the oldest rosebush, a leather-bound box containing letters that proved his family's legacy was even more rotten than he'd thought. Margaret was watching him with that knowing look she sometimes got. Whatever you're planning, Adrian, be careful. Men like Cedric don't lose gracefully. Neither do I. No, she agreed. But you lose differently. He destroys to win. You destroy to make sure no one else has to. She drifted away before he could tell her she was wrong, leaving him alone with a truth he'd spent years trying to ignore. There was no moral high ground in this world. There was only choosing which kind of damage you were willing to live with. Adrian left the party without saying goodbye to anyone. His carriage waited in the circular drive, the horses restless in the cooling evening air. The ride back to Blackthorn Manor took 40 minutes through countryside that belonged to families who'd learned to hate his name before they learned to read. The estate appeared over the hill like something out of a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. Moonlight turned the white stone silver, made the gardens look almost alive. Almost. Thomas, his head butler, and one of the few people who'd known Adrian since childhood, met him at the door with the kind of expression that meant bad news. The artist's luggage arrived early, Your Grace, and there's been a complication. Adrian's headache, which had been building all evening, doubled. What kind of complication? The kind where Miss Vale apparently decided to arrive a day early, walked past every servant who tried to stop her, and somehow found her way into the Moonlit garden approximately 2 hours ago. The world went very quiet. No one entered that garden. Adrian had made that rule absolute the moment he'd inherited the estate. The staff knew. Everyone knew. It was the one boundary he'd enforced with iron consistency. Where is she now? Still in the garden, Your Grace. She's been digging. Adrian didn't run. Running would imply panic, and Dukes didn't panic, but he moved through the manor with a speed that probably looked close enough. The Moonlit garden sat at the eastern edge of the estate, surrounded by walls thick enough to muffle sound and gates that stayed locked unless Adrian himself opened them. Tonight, the gates hung open, not broken, but unlocked from the inside. She'd picked the lock. The woman had been on his property for less than 3 hours, and she'd already picked the lock to the one place that was supposed to be impossible to access. Adrian stepped through the gates and stopped. The garden was everything he remembered. Wild roses growing over themselves in barely controlled chaos, marble fountains choked with moss, pathways that curved around statues whose faces had been deliberately smudged into anonymity. Moonlight turned everything silver and shadow, made it look like the kind of place where secrets went to die. And in the center of it all, kneeling in the dirt beside the oldest rose bush, with a small spade in her hand and her hair falling out of what might have once been a professional arrangement, was Evelyn Vale. She'd already dug up the leather box. It sat open beside her, letters scattered across the ground like evidence at a crime scene. She didn't hear him approach, too focused on the document in her hands, reading by moonlight, her expression shifting between fascination and horror. Adrian's voice came out colder than he'd intended. "You have 10 seconds to explain why you're still breathing." To her credit, she didn't scream, didn't drop the letters. She looked up at him with eyes that reflected moonlight and something that might have been anger instead of fear. "You're late," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to explain what the hell this is." Wrong response. She should have apologized, should have stammered excuses, should have recognized that she'd crossed a line most people wouldn't dare look at, let alone step over. Adrian moved closer, and she stood to meet him. Shorter than he'd expected, maybe 5'6" in her dirt-covered boots, with paint stains on her sleeve and a smudge of soil across one cheekbone. Nothing like the polished nobles he was used to dealing with. Nothing like someone who understood how much danger she was in. "Those letters are private property," he said. "You're trespassing on restricted grounds. I could have you arrested before sunrise." "For what? Reading the truth about your family?" She held up one of the letters. "This is dated 40 years ago. It's signed by someone named Margot Blackthorne to a man named William Thorne. Your father destroyed their relationship, framed William for treason, and had him executed, all to secure a political alliance with the Ashbourne family." The words hit like bullets. Accurate, damning, everything Adrian had discovered 3 months ago when he'd first opened that box. "You don't know what you're reading," he said. "I know exactly what I'm reading. I also found this." She reached into the box and pulled out a small leather journal. "Margot's diary. She was your father's sister. The woman he claimed died of fever? She killed herself in this garden the night William was executed. Your family built this place to hide the evidence." Adrian's hands clenched. "Put it back." "Why? So you can keep pretending your family legacy is anything other than blood and lies? So you can walk away before you become part of that legacy." That made her pause. Finally. Some survival instinct kicking in through whatever righteous fury had carried her this far. The moonlight caught her face, and for the first time, Adrian really looked at her. Young, maybe 25, sharp features that suggested intelligence and stubbornness in equal measure. The kind of person who probably made decisions first and thought about consequences later. The kind of person who got hurt in worlds like his. "I came here to restore roses," she said quietly. Lady Pemberton said Blackthorne Manor needed someone who understood botanical art and historic garden rehabilitation. She didn't mention I'd be walking into the middle of a covered-up murder. It wasn't murder. It was politics. In this world, there's a difference. "No," Evelyn said. "There really isn't." She was right, of course. That was the problem with letting people see too much. They started asking questions that didn't have good answers. Adrian picked up one of the scattered letters, his father's handwriting stark across the aged paper. Efficient, calculated. The same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and death warrants with equal care. "Some secrets destroy anyone who learns them," he said. "This is your one chance to walk away. Take it." Evelyn looked at the garden around them, the wild roses, the hidden pathways, the weight of decades pressing down on everything. Then she looked back at him with something that might have been understanding or might have been defiance. "What if I don't want to walk away?" Wrong answer. Again. And somewhere in the back of Adrian's mind, the part that still remembered what it felt like to want something beyond survival whispered, "This is going to ruin you both." He should have sent her away, should have paid her double, and put her on the first carriage back to wherever she came from. should have locked the gates and burned the letters and pretended none of this had ever happened. Instead, he heard himself say, "Then you're a fool." "Probably," she agreed, "but I'm also really good with roses, and it seems like this garden could use some help." The moon hung overhead like a judge waiting for a verdict. Around them, the roses rustled in wind that smelled like rain and old secrets. And Adrian Blackthorne, who'd spent 15 years learning how to feel nothing, felt the first crack in armor he'd thought was impenetrable. This was a mistake. He knew it. She probably knew it too. Neither of them moved to leave. "The staff will show you to the guest wing," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, we'll discuss the terms of your employment. If you mention what you found here to anyone—" "You'll do what? Have me arrested? Killed? Added to the family collection of inconvenient people who knew too much?" "I'll tell you the rest of the story. All of it. And then you'll understand why some doors stay locked." That caught her attention. Curiosity flickered across her face. Dangerous, sharp, the kind of look that started revolutions or got people killed. "Deal," she said. She gathered the letters carefully, placed them back in the box with hands that suggested she knew how to handle fragile things, and walked past him toward the gates. At the threshold, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said without looking back, "I don't think you're like your father. You don't know anything about me. I know you could have destroyed these letters months ago when you found them, but you didn't. That means something." She disappeared into the darkness beyond the garden, leaving Adrian alone with the roses and the truth he'd been avoiding since the night he'd first opened that box. His father's sins weren't the only ones buried here. There were crimes generations deep, scandals that reached into families who still held power, secrets that could bring down half the nobility if they ever saw daylight. And now there was a witness, a woman with dirt under her fingernails and truth in her eyes who'd probably never learned the first rule of survival in this world. Sometimes the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. Adrian locked the garden gates behind him and walked back toward the manor. Tomorrow, he'd explain the rules. Tomorrow, she'd understand why he kept people at a distance. Tomorrow, everything would go back to normal. But as he reached his study and poured himself a drink he'd actually consumed this time, he couldn't shake the image of Evelyn kneeling in the moonlight, reading his family's sins like they were scripture, looking at him like he might be capable of something other than maintaining the status quo. It had been 15 years since Catherine died. 15 years since Adrian had let himself care about anything beyond damage control and strategic survival. 15 years of being exactly what the world expected: cold, competent, untouchable. And now this woman shows up, breaks into the one place he'd tried to protect, and asks him what if? What if the truth mattered? What if the legacy could be changed? What if he was more than the sum of his father's choices? Adrian drained his glass and poured another. Across the estate, in the guest wing where she'd been escorted by bewildered servants, Evelyn Vale sat by the window looking out at the moonlit garden. The letters sat on the desk beside her. Evidence, confession, and map, all in one. She knew she should be terrified. Knew she'd crossed about 17 different lines tonight, but all she could think about was the look in Duke Blackthorne's eyes when she'd asked, what if he wasn't like his father? He'd looked like a man who'd forgotten hope was an option. And something in her, some stupid, stubborn part that had gotten her in trouble her entire life, wanted to remind him. The moon climbed higher. The roses in the forbidden garden grew wild in the darkness. And two people who should never have met began the kind of dance that would either save them both or destroy everything they touched. Otaek. Neither of them slept that night. Adrian, because the past had a way of returning no matter how deep you buried it. And Evelyn, because she'd finally found something worth the risk. By dawn, Lord Cedric Ashbourne received an interesting piece of information from his network of servants and spies. The new artist at Blackthorne Manor had spent 3 hours alone in the moonlit garden, the garden that wasn't supposed to exist, the garden where evidence of the Ashbourne family's greatest political victory had been buried 40 years ago. Cedric smiled, poured his morning tea, and began making plans. Because if there was one thing he'd learned from Adrian's father, it was this: every secret had a price, and someone always paid. Morning came without mercy. Adrian hadn't slept, just sat in his study watching shadows move across the ceiling until dawn bled through the curtains like an accusation. The whiskey bottle sat empty on his desk next to the letters he'd retrieved from the garden after Evelyn left. His father's handwriting stared up at him. Efficient, cold. The same hand that had signed Adrian's inheritance papers had also signed William Thorne's death warrant. There was a knock. Thomas entered without waiting for permission, which meant whatever news he carried was bad enough to override protocol. Lord Ashbourne's carriage was spotted on the eastern road this morning, Thomas said. He's heading this way. Adrian's jaw tightened. It's 7 a.m. Yes, Your Grace. Which means he either didn't sleep or he's been traveling since before dawn. Which meant Cedric already knew. Someone in the household staff was feeding him information. Had probably been feeding him information for months. Adrian made a mental note to find out who and deal with it later. Where's Miss Vale? The morning room. She requested coffee and the estate's botanical records. Cook says she's been there since 5. Of course she had. The woman probably ran on stubbornness and spite instead of actual rest. Adrian found her surrounded by leather-bound journals, sketches spread across the table, dirt still under her fingernails from last night's excavation. She'd changed clothes, but her hair was still wild, pulled back in a way that suggested function over aesthetics. She looked up when he entered. No fear in her eyes. That should have been a warning sign. Your family's garden records are incomplete, she said without preamble. Someone removed entire sections. Years' worth of documentation just gone. Why? Good morning to you too. It's not a good morning. It's a morning where I'm realizing the garden I was hired to restore has been deliberately sabotaged for decades. So I'll ask again, why? Adrian poured himself coffee he didn't want and took the chair across from her. Because my father didn't want anyone understanding what the garden really was. Which is? A monument to every person he destroyed to maintain power. Every statue in that garden represents someone whose life he ended. Every locked pathway leads to buried evidence. The roses? They were Margot's. She planted them before she died. My father kept them alive as a reminder. Evelyn's expression shifted. Not horror, something darker. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition of a cruelty that went beyond simple violence. A reminder of what? That he could take beautiful things and turn them into weapons. That even love could be used as leverage if you were ruthless enough. The words tasted like ash. Adrian had spent years learning his father's lessons, understanding the mechanics of power, watching how easily people could be broken if you knew which pressure points to hit. And then Catherine died, and he'd realized the old man had been right about everything except one thing. Some costs were too high even for survival. Lord Ashbourne is coming, Adrian said. He'll be here within the hour. When he arrives, you're going to tell him you found nothing in the garden except dying roses. Evelyn set down her coffee carefully. I'm going to what? You heard me. Whatever you saw last night, whatever you read, it doesn't exist. You were hired to restore flowers. That's all. That's not all. That's you asking me to lie about evidence of murder. It's me asking you to stay alive. Cedric Ashbourne's family was complicit in William Thorne's execution. If he finds out you have proof of that, you become a problem. And Cedric solves problems permanently. She leaned back, studying him with eyes that saw too much. You're afraid. I'm realistic. There's a difference. No. You're afraid, not of him. Of becoming like your father. Of using the same tactics he did. So instead you just, what? Let the corruption continue? Let people like Ashbourne keep playing the same games? Adrian's temper, carefully controlled for years, cracked. You've been here less than 24 hours and you think you understand how this works? My father spent 40 years building a network of blackmail and brutality. Half the nobles in this country owe their positions to deals made in that garden. The other half are terrified of what he knew about them. I inherited all of it, every dirty secret, every piece of leverage, every weapon he ever forged. You want me to use them? To become exactly what he was? I want you to decide what you are, she shot back, because right now you're just a man sitting on a pile of ammunition he's too scared to fire, watching the world burn because at least that way you're not responsible. The truth of it hit like a fist to the chest. She wasn't wrong. Adrian had spent 15 years in a holding pattern, maintaining his father's empire without expanding it, keeping enemies at bay without making new allies, existing in a kind of stasis where nothing got better but nothing got catastrophically worse. It was cowardice dressed up as principle. Before he could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, Lord Ashbourne has arrived." Adrian stood. "Remember what I said. You found nothing." Evelyn's expression went cold. "Go to hell. Already there. Welcome to the neighborhood." He left her in the morning room and went to meet the snake at his door. Cedric stood in the entrance hall looking like he'd stepped out of a portrait. Immaculate morning coat, golden hair perfectly arranged, smile sharp enough to draw blood. The kind of man who made charm look like a weapon. "Adrian, forgive the early hour, but I heard you'd hired that artist Margaret Pemberton recommended. Thought I'd come see the restoration work for myself." Lies built on lies. They both knew exactly why he was here. "The work hasn't begun yet," Adrian said. "Miss Vale only arrived yesterday. Still, I'd love to see the famous Moonlit garden. It's been closed to visitors for so long. Rumor has it your father designed it himself." "My father designed many things. Most of them are better left alone." Cedric's smile never wavered. "Come now. Surely there's no harm in a brief tour for old times' sake?" Old times, when Cedric's father and Adrian's father had orchestrated William Thorne's execution together. When the Ashbourne family had benefited from the political void Thorne's death created. When two families built their fortunes on a murder and called it statecraft. "The garden isn't open to visitors," Adrian said flatly. "Not even to friends?" "We're not friends, Cedric. We're two people who inherited our father's wars and haven't figured out how to end them yet." For a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped. Beneath Cedric's charm was something colder, more calculating. The real man underneath all that polish. "Your father understood that wars don't end," Cedric said quietly. "They just change management. He knew when to fight and when to collaborate. You could learn from that." "I learned plenty from my father, including how to recognize a threat when it walks through my front door." The tension crackled between them. Two predators circling, both aware that the first one to move would trigger something neither could control. Then Evelyn's voice cut through the standoff. "Your Grace, I need to show you something in the garden. It's urgent." She stood at the top of the stairs, still in her work clothes, dirt smudged across her cheek, looking entirely out of place among the marble and mirrors, and entirely unbothered by the two most dangerous men in the province staring at her. Adrian's stomach dropped. She was supposed to stay quiet, supposed to play it safe. Cedric's attention shifted to her like a hawk spotting prey. "Miss Vale, I presume. Cedric Ashbourne. I've heard wonderful things about your botanical work." "Have you?" Not a question. Her tone was flat, unimpressed. "Your Grace, the rose situation is worse than I thought. We need to discuss treatment options immediately." She was giving him an out, a reason to refuse Cedric's garden tour without raising suspicion. Smart, dangerously smart. Adrian caught her eye and saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not fear, not calculation. Trust. She was trusting him to follow her lead. When was the last time someone had trusted him with anything? "Apologies, Ashbourne," Adrian said. "Estate business takes priority." Cedric's smile went sharp. "Of course. Though I do hope I'll have a chance to tour the gardens before Miss Vale completes her restoration. It would be a shame to miss seeing them in their original state." The threat was clear. He wanted access before Evelyn could destroy evidence, before whatever secrets the garden held could be sanitized or removed. "I'll have Thomas show you out," Adrian said. For a moment, Cedric didn't move, just stood there studying them both. Adrian's carefully blank expression, Evelyn's defensive posture, calculating, weighing options. Then he inclined his head graciously. "Until next time, then. Miss Vale, I look forward to seeing your work." He left like smoke dissipating, there one moment, gone the next, leaving only the faint sense that something poisonous had just passed through. The moment the door closed, Evelyn sagged against the banister. "That's the man who wants the letters?" "That's the man whose family helped create the situation those letters document. And now you've confirmed there's something in the garden worth hiding. I confirmed there are dying roses that need attention, which is true. Everything else was subtext." Adrian climbed the stairs to where she stood, close enough to see the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, close enough to smell dirt and coffee and something floral he couldn't identify. "You should have stayed silent," he said. He would have pushed until you let him in. This way you have time to prepare. Prepare for what? She met his gaze steadily. For whatever happens when he realizes you're not going to hand me over. The assumption in those words, that Adrian would protect her, that he'd already chosen a side, should have annoyed him, should have triggered every instinct that said getting involved was suicide. Instead, it felt like something clicking into place, a decision made before he'd consciously acknowledged there was a decision to make. "The garden," he said. "Show me what you actually found." They walked through the estate in silence, past servants who'd learned not to ask questions, through corridors lined with portraits of blackthorns who'd all mastered the art of looking noble while being monstrous. Adrian's father smiled down from oil paint, forever frozen in the lie of respectability. The garden waited behind its locked gates. In daylight, it looked different, less mysterious, more abandoned. Roses climbed over themselves in desperate tangles. Marble statues wept moss. The fountains sat dry and cracked. Evelyn led him to a section he'd never fully explored, where the pathways curved into shadow, and the roses grew so thick they formed walls. "Your father didn't just bury letters," she said. "He buried a whole documentation system. Look." She'd uncovered 3 more boxes overnight, must have come back after he'd left, worked by moonlight like some kind of gothic detective. Each box contained journals, correspondence, photographs decades old. Evidence. Meticulous. Damning. "These names," Evelyn said, pulling out a list written in his father's hand. "They're all families that fell from power in the last 30 years. Bankruptcies, scandals, deaths. Your father documented every single manipulation." Adrian's hand shook as he took the list. He recognized names, families he'd grown up knowing, watching them crumble one by one. He'd always assumed it was just the natural churn of power, winners and losers, survival of the most ruthless. But this was different. This was systematic, deliberate. His father hadn't just participated in the game, he'd rigged it from the start. "There's more," Evelyn said quietly. She handed him a leather journal, page already marked. "Read the date." He didn't want to. Knew instinctively that whatever was written there would change something fundamental. But he read it anyway. The entry was from 15 years ago, 3 months before Catherine died. His father's handwriting detailed a plan. Catherine's family had been asking questions about the Thorn execution, digging into old alliances. They were becoming a liability. The solution was elegant: arrange an accident, make it look like tragedy, use Adrian's grief to secure his loyalty permanently. The words blurred. Adrian's throat closed. He'd spent 15 years believing Catherine's death was random. A writing accident, tragic but meaningless. Just bad luck in a world full of bad luck. But it wasn't luck. It was murder, planned, executed, and the man responsible had been his father. "Adrian!" Evelyn's voice seemed to come from very far away. He was going to be sick, or kill something, or both. "I need—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't make his brain form words when all it wanted to do was scream. Evelyn's hand closed around his wrist, firm, grounding. "Breathe, just breathe." He did. In, out, until the roaring in his ears subsided enough for rational thought to creep back in. "He killed her," Adrian said. The words came out broken. "All this time I thought, but he killed her." "Yes." "Because her family was asking questions, because they were becoming inconvenient." "Yes. And I inherited everything, the estate, the power, all built on her corpse." Evelyn's grip tightened. "That's not your fault, isn't it? I used everything he built, benefited from every crime he committed. I knew what kind of man he was, and I still—" "You survived. That's what you did. You survived a monster by learning his language. That doesn't make you him." Adrian looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who'd known him for less than a day, who'd somehow seen past 15 years of carefully constructed armor to the raw wound underneath. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "Because someone should, and because I'm tired of watching good people lose because they're afraid of becoming bad people." "I'm not good." "Maybe not. But you're trying to be, and that counts for something." The journal sat between them, pages full of poison. Around them, the garden held its secrets close. Decades of manipulation, violence, control. Everything Adrian had tried to distance himself from, contained in a space he'd tried to pretend didn't exist. If this gets out, he said slowly, it doesn't just destroy my father's legacy. It destroys half the noble families in the country. Cedric's family, the Pembertons, the Marlowes, everyone who collaborated or benefited. The entire social structure collapses. Good. Her conviction was absolute, uncompromising, the kind of certainty Adrian had lost years ago. You don't understand what that means, he said. The chaos, the violence. People will die in the power vacuum. Innocent people. People are already dying. They're just dying quietly, while men like your father and Cedric Ashbourne maintain order. At least chaos is honest about what it costs. She had a point, a dangerous, revolutionary, completely insane point. And what do you suggest? Adrian asked. I what? Publish everything? Invite the authorities to investigate? Burn it all down and hope something better grows from the ashes? I suggest you decide whether you want to be the man who maintains the system or the man who breaks it, because staying neutral isn't an option anymore. Cedric knows something's here. He's going to push until he gets access or until he forces your hand. You can either control the narrative or let it control you. Adrian laughed, sharp, bitter. You're asking me to start a war. I'm asking you to finish one. Your father started it 40 years ago when he killed William Thorne. Every manipulation, every death, every life destroyed since then has been an extension of that original sin. Someone has to draw a line. Why not you? Because drawing lines meant accepting responsibility, meant choosing action over paralysis, meant becoming the kind of person who shaped events instead of just surviving them, meant risking everything on the possibility that truth mattered more than stability. Adrian had spent 15 years avoiding exactly that choice. 15 years telling himself that maintaining the status quo was enough, that preventing new atrocities justified ignoring old ones. But looking at Evelyn, at this stubborn, reckless woman who'd broken into his garden and his carefully controlled life with equal disregard for consequences, he realized something terrifying. He wanted to be the person she seemed to think he could be. If we do this, he said carefully, there's no going back. Cedric will come for us with everything he has. Other families will unite against the threat. We'll be targets. I know. You could die. I could die. We could destroy everything and still lose. I know. Then why? Evelyn looked around the garden. The wild roses, the crumbling statues, the weight of decades pressing down on every stone. Because someone has to say enough. Someone has to look at all this accumulated power built on suffering and say no more. And if it's going to be anyone, it might as well be the people standing in the place where it all began. Adrian felt something shift inside him. Not hope. Hope was too clean a word for what this was. More like the moment before a decision becomes irreversible. The instant before stepping off a cliff when you're not sure if you'll fly or fall, but you know you can't stay on solid ground anymore. We'll need allies, he said. People we can trust. Margaret Pemberton, maybe. She has no love for Cedric. And we'll need to be smart about how we release the information. Strategic. Make sure the right people see it at the right time. We'll also need leverage. Something to protect us when Cedric inevitably tries to retaliate. Evelyn smiled. Fierce, dangerous. We have leverage. We have 40 years of documentation proving exactly how the system works. That's more power than Cedric's ever had. They stood in the garden where Adrian's father had buried his sins, where Margot Blackthorne had planted roses before taking her own life, where generations of secrets had rotted into the soil. And for the first time since inheriting this poisoned legacy, Adrian felt something other than resignation. He felt ready. Tomorrow, he said, we start going through everything, every document, every letter, every piece of evidence. We build a case so airtight that even the people who benefited can't deny it. And then we burn it all down and see what grows. Evelyn's hand was still on his wrist. Her grip had shifted from grounding to something else. Partnership, maybe. Or recognition of shared madness. Your father built this garden to hide what he'd done, she said. What if we turn it into evidence instead? Open it to the public. Make it a monument to truth instead of secrets. The idea was audacious, reckless. Exactly the kind of gesture that would force everyone's hand. Adrian nodded slowly. The Moon Festival, 6 weeks from now. Every noble family attends. We could unveil everything then. Make it impossible to ignore or suppress. Cedric will try to stop us. Let him try. We'll be ready. They walked back through the garden together, past roses that had survived decades of neglect, past statues that had witnessed generations of crimes. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, making everything sharp and clear. Behind them, the locked gates swung in the breeze. Ahead, Blackthorn Manor waited, full of servants who needed protection, rooms that held evidence, a legacy that demanded reckoning. Adrian had spent 15 years trying to outrun his father's shadow. Now he was going to step directly into it, not to become what the old man was, but to dismantle everything he'd built. It was suicide. It was necessary. It was the only choice that felt like living instead of just existing. They reached the manor as clouds rolled in from the west, promising rain. Thomas met them at the door with his usual impeccable timing and concerned expression. "Your Grace, Lord Ashbourne's carriage was seen stopping at the Pemberton estate. He's calling in his network." Of course he was. Cedric never did anything by half measures. "Then we'll need to move faster," Adrian said. "Thomas, I need you to send discreet messages to anyone we can trust. Tell them there will be revelations at the Moon Festival. Tell them the truth about the old alliances is coming to light." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Understanding. Maybe relief. "It's about time, Your Grace." "You knew?" "I've served this family for 40 years. I knew enough." He paused. "Your father was a brilliant man, but brilliance and goodness aren't the same thing. I'm glad you've realized that." The old butler left to carry out his instructions, and Adrian turned to find Evelyn watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" "You're different," she said, "from last night, like something's been decided." "Something has. I'm going to destroy my family's legacy, make enemies of half the nobility, and probably get us both killed in the process. But at least I'll die doing something that matters instead of maintaining someone else's empire of lies." That's the most hopeful thing I've heard in years. That says disturbing things about your definition of hope. She laughed, real, unguarded. The sound echoed through the entrance hall, bright against all that marble and inherited guilt. And Adrian Blackthorn, who'd spent 15 years forgetting how to feel anything resembling joy, found himself almost smiling. Outside, rain began to fall, the kind of rain that washed things clean or drowned them completely, depending on whether you could swim. They were about to find out which. Across the province, in a drawing room full of expensive furniture and expensive people, Cedric Ashbourne laid out his strategy to allies who shared his interests and his sins. "Blackthorn has documentation," he said. "Everything his father collected. If it becomes public, we all fall." Lord Pemberton, Margaret's third and final husband before his mysterious death, frowned. "Then we take the documentation. Discredit the girl. Make Blackthorn look unstable. Or we could remove the problem permanently," suggested Lady Marlowe, whose family shipping empire was built on deals Adrian's father had brokered. Cedric considered, weighed options, made the kind of calculation that separated survivors from corpses in their world. "Not yet," he said finally. "First we isolate him, turn public opinion, make sure that when the evidence does surface, and it will, no one believes it. We control the narrative before he can weaponize the truth. And if that doesn't work?" Cedric's smile was cold. "Then we do what our fathers did. We make problems disappear, quietly, efficiently, and we make sure no one asks questions afterward." The rain fell harder. The game was moving into its next phase, and somewhere between Blackthorn Manor and the Moonlit Garden, between truth and power, between the people who wanted change and the people who'd killed to prevent it, the real war was beginning. Adrian stood at his study window, watching water stream down glass, and felt the weight of what he'd just committed to. 6 weeks until the Moon Festival. 6 weeks to gather evidence, build alliances, prepare for war. 6 weeks until he either freed himself from his father's shadow or died trying. Evelyn appeared beside him, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. She offered him one without comment. "To revolution," she said. "To survival," Adrian countered. "To whatever happens when we stop pretending we have a choice." They drank. The whiskey burned, the rain pounded against stone and glass. And in the moonlit garden, roses that had been dying for decades began to bloom, fed by truth, finally breaking through soil that had kept it buried too long. There was no going back now, only forward, into whatever fire or freedom waited on the other side. The next 3 weeks moved like a countdown to execution. Adrian and Evelyn worked through nights that blurred into mornings, cataloging evidence his father had spent decades accumulating. Every document they unearthed revealed another layer of corruption: judges bought, elections rigged, competitors eliminated through methods that ranged from financial ruin to outright murder. The Moonlit garden became their war room. Evelyn restored the roses by day, while Adrian sorted through his father's legacy by night, both of them pretending the work was separate when it was really the same thing, bringing life to something that had been deliberately killed. Thomas proved invaluable. The old butler had 40 years of institutional memory and a network of servants across every major estate in the province. Information flowed in steadily: who was meeting with Cedric, which families were hedging their bets, where the battle lines were forming. Margaret Pemberton became their most surprising ally. She arrived at Blackthorn Manor 3 days after Adrian sent his coded message, took one look at the evidence spread across the garden pavilion, and laughed until tears ran down her face. "You magnificent bastards," she'd said. "You're actually going to do it." Then she'd rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work. Margaret had survived 3 husbands and countless scandals by understanding leverage better than anyone. She knew which nobles would crack under pressure, which ones would fight, which ones could be bought or blackmailed into neutrality. But as the Moon Festival approached, Adrian noticed things that didn't fit. Small things. A servant lingering too long in hallways, documents slightly out of place, the feeling of being watched even in spaces that should have been secure. He told himself it was paranoia, that years of isolation had made him see threats in shadows, but the feeling persisted, sharp as broken glass under skin. 2 weeks before the festival, everything accelerated. Adrian was in his study reviewing testimony from families his father had destroyed when Thomas entered without knocking. The butler's face was gray. "Your Grace, Lady Catherine's family, the Thornfields, Lord Marcus has requested an audience." Adrian's pen stopped mid-stroke. He hadn't spoken to Catherine's brother in 15 years, not since the funeral, when Marcus had looked at him with eyes full of grief and accusation and asked why Adrian hadn't been there when she died. "Send him in." Marcus Thornfield had aged badly. Only 37, but already going gray at the temples, lines carved deep around his mouth. He looked like a man who'd spent years drowning and had only recently found air. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at Adrian. Then he said very quietly, "You found it." The journal entry about Catherine. Adrian's blood went cold. "How did you—" "My father never stopped investigating. He knew it wasn't an accident, spent his last years trying to prove it. He died believing he'd failed. But 3 days ago, someone sent me copies. Anonymously. Evidence that your father ordered Catherine's death." The room tilted. Adrian gripped the desk edge. "Who sent them?" Marcus pulled an envelope from his coat. Plain paper, no seal, no signature, just the documents and a note saying the full truth would be revealed at the Moon Festival. "Let me see it." The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. Adrian's chest constricted as recognition hit like a fist. Margaret's handwriting. But why would Margaret, unless she wasn't working with them at all, unless she'd been playing a different game from the start? Adrian's mind raced through the last 3 weeks. Every conversation, every piece of information Margaret had access to, every strategic decision she'd influenced. Oh God. Marcus was still talking. "I came here to kill you, spent the whole ride planning it, but then I realized, you didn't know, did you? About Catherine. You've been living with the guilt thinking it was random tragedy." Adrian couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the implications spiraling out from Margaret's betrayal. "Your father made you a weapon and never told you what you were aimed at," Marcus continued. "That's almost worse than if you'd been complicit. At least then you'd have been making choices." "Where's your family now?" Adrian forced the words out. "Safe. Away from the province. I'm not stupid enough to bring them within reach of whatever's coming." "Smart. You should leave too. I'm not leaving until I see your father's legacy burned to ash. Whatever you're planning for the festival, I'm in." It was the kind of alliance Adrian would have welcomed a week ago. Now it felt like one more piece moving on a board he no longer controlled. After Marcus left, Adrian sat in the dark and tried to think. Margaret had been feeding information to Catherine's family, which meant she'd probably been feeding it to others too. Cedric, most likely. Maybe even people Adrian hadn't identified as enemies yet. Every strategy they'd planned, every piece of evidence they'd organized, every ally they'd contacted, Margaret had known all of it, which meant Cedric knew, which meant they were walking into the Moon Festival completely exposed. He found Evelyn in the garden, working by lamplight to transplant a section of Margot's original roses. She looked up when he approached, saw his face, and immediately set down her spade. What happened? Margaret's been compromising us, feeding information to Catherine's family. Probably to Cedric, too. Evelyn went very still. How do you know? The evidence doesn't matter. What matters is we're exposed. Everything we've planned, every move we intended to make, they know. Then we changed the plan. To what? We've spent 3 weeks building toward a specific strategy. The festival is in 2 weeks. We don't have time to rebuild from scratch. Evelyn stood, wiping dirt from her hands with mechanical precision. The gesture was so normal, so grounded, that it made Adrian's chest ache. She was 25 years old, and he'd dragged her into a war that was going to destroy them both. Why would Margaret do this, she asked. What does she gain? Adrian had been asking himself the same question. Margaret had survived by being adaptable, by always positioning herself on the winning side, which meant she doesn't think we can win. She's hedging her bets, giving Cedric information while maintaining plausible deniability with us. That way, whoever comes out on top, she's protected. That's not hedging. That's betrayal. In this world, they're the same thing. Evelyn's expression hardened. Then we make sure she loses either way. We feed her false information, make her think we're doing one thing while we do another. We don't have time. We make time. You said yourself your father built his power on misdirection. So we learn from him. We play the game better than he did. There was something almost frightening in her conviction. This woman who'd never navigated noble politics, who'd been raised in a world where people generally meant what they said and did what they promised, was adapting to brutality faster than Adrian had. It should have worried him. Instead, it felt like recognition, like finding someone who could match him step for step into whatever darkness waited ahead. They spent the next 48 hours rebuilding everything. New strategies, new contingencies, information carefully compartmentalized, so no single person except Adrian and Evelyn knew the complete picture. Thomas was brought fully into confidence. Marcus Thornfield became their liaison to families who'd been destroyed by Adrian's father, people who had every reason to want the truth exposed and no love for the current power structure. And they prepared a special surprise for Margaret Pemberton. The night before the Moon Festival, Adrian hosted a small dinner party. Just the core group, Margaret, Marcus, Thomas, Evelyn, and a handful of carefully selected nobles who'd committed to supporting their revelation. The dining room glittered with silver and crystal. Servants moved efficiently between courses. Everything looked civilized, almost normal. Margaret held court at the far end of the table, charming and sharp as ever, telling stories about her various husbands' deaths with the kind of gallows humor that made people unsure whether to laugh or be horrified. Adrian watched her perform and felt nothing. No anger, no betrayal, just cold assessment of a problem that needed solving. Across the table, Evelyn caught his eye. Ready? He nodded fractionally. Evelyn stood, glass in hand. A toast. To truth, to justice, and to friends who stand beside us when the cost is highest. Everyone raised their glasses, except Margaret, whose expression flickered for just a moment. Uncertainty. Maybe fear. Actually, Evelyn continued, before we drink, there's something Adrian and I wanted to share. A preview of tomorrow's revelations. She nodded to Thomas, who produced a leather portfolio. Inside were documents, letters, evidence, but not the real evidence. This was the bait. These letters prove Lord Ashbourne's father was the primary architect of William Thorne's execution, Evelyn said. Adrian's father was complicit, certainly, but the Ashbournes orchestrated everything. Tomorrow, we'll be presenting this evidence publicly. It was a lie. A beautiful, calculated lie designed to do one thing. Make Margaret run to Cedric with false information that would position him as the primary target. Margaret's face remained perfectly composed, but Adrian saw the moment she made her decision. Saw her mentally calculating how to get word to Cedric before morning. How comprehensive is this evidence? Margaret asked. Will it hold up under scrutiny? Absolutely, Adrian said. We have testimony from 3 witnesses who were present during the planning stages. The Ashbourne family is finished. Around the table, the carefully selected nobles reacted with appropriate shock and satisfaction. They'd all been briefed on the real plan. This performance was entirely for Margaret's benefit. The dinner continued. More wine, more conversation. Margaret laughed at all the right moments, engaged with all the right people, and excused herself early with apologies about a headache. The moment her carriage disappeared down the drive, Marcus turned to Adrian. She bought it? She bought it. Which means by dawn, Cedric will know we're planning to make him the primary target tomorrow. He'll spend all night preparing a defense, repositioning his allies, getting ready for an attack that isn't coming. And while he's doing that? Marcus asked. Adrian smiled without humor. While he's doing that, we'll be executing the real plan, the one Margaret never knew about. Evelyn refilled her wine glass. You know she'll figure it out eventually. She'll realize we fed her false information. By then it won't matter. The truth will already be public. And Margaret will have to choose whether to stand with the exposed corruption or try to claim she was deceived like everyone else. Either way, Thomas added quietly, her credibility is destroyed. No one will trust her again. It was brutal, efficient, exactly the kind of tactic Adrian's father would have used. The realization sat heavy in his chest. He'd become what he'd sworn to avoid, manipulative, calculating, willing to sacrifice people to achieve objectives. The difference, he told himself, was that his objectives were different. He was destroying a corrupt system, not maintaining one. But the methods were the same, and methods had a way of shaping the people who used them. Evelyn found him later, alone on the terrace overlooking the moonlit garden. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him in the dark. I'm turning into him, Adrian said. My father. Using people, manipulating outcomes, lying to achieve goals. Are you? I just orchestrated Margaret's downfall using tactics he taught me. You orchestrated Margaret's downfall because she betrayed you. That's not the same as what your father did. He destroyed people for profit and power. You're doing it for survival and justice. The line between those things gets thinner every day. Maybe. Or maybe the line was always thin and you're just now seeing it clearly. She had a point. Adrian had spent years pretending there was a clean way to navigate this world, a way to remain untainted while still maintaining position. But that had always been self-deception. Power required compromise. Change required force. And purity was a luxury only people without stakes could afford. Tomorrow changes everything, he said. No matter how it goes. I know, people will get hurt, maybe killed, the social order will collapse. Whatever replaces it might not be better. Probably won't be. At least not at first. Then why are we doing this? Evelyn turned to look at him. Because the alternative is maintaining a system built on your father's sins. Because someone has to say enough. Because even if we fail, at least we'll have tried. And if we die? Then we die having chosen something, instead of just inheriting the consequences of other people's choices. The moon hung low and full, painting the garden silver. Tomorrow night, that same moon would watch the moon festival. Hundreds of nobles gathered in false celebration, while Adrian and Evelyn dismantled the foundations of everything those nobles represented. If this works, Adrian said slowly, my name gets destroyed along with my father's. Blackthorn becomes synonymous with corruption. Everything I've tried to preserve, the estate, the legacy, the position, it all burns. Good. Let it burn. You can build something new from the ashes. You have a lot of faith in my ability to rebuild. I have faith in your ability to try. That's all anyone can do. She left him alone with the garden and the moon and the weight of what was coming. And Adrian Blackthorn, who'd spent 15 years trying to be something other than his father's son, made peace with the fact that tomorrow he'd become exactly what the old man had raised him to be. A weapon. The difference was, this time he got to choose the target. Dawn broke cold and clear. The Moon Festival preparations began at first light, servants transforming Blackthorn Manor and its grounds into something that looked magical. Lanterns by the thousands, tables laden with food, an orchestra setting up in the main pavilion. Everything designed to impress and overwhelm. By noon, carriages began arriving. Nobles from across the province, dressed in their finest, wearing smiles that hid calculations. They came because attending was mandatory, because the Moon Festival was tradition, because not attending would signal something, and in this world, signals were dangerous. Cedric arrived early, surrounded by allies, looking confident and controlled. He'd spent the night preparing a defense against accusations Margaret had fed him. Adrian could see it in how his supporters positioned themselves, how they whispered and watched, ready to counter an attack they thought was coming. Margaret arrived fashionably late, alone, scanning the crowd with eyes that missed nothing. She spotted Adrian and Evelyn near the garden entrance and approached with her usual confidence. "Darling," she said to Adrian, kissing his cheek. "Such a wonderful turnout. You must be pleased." "Thrilled," Adrian said flatly. Something in his tone made her pause. Her eyes narrowed fractionally. "Is something wrong? We'll see, won't we?" She drifted away, but Adrian noticed she stayed close to the exits. Smart. She knew something was off, but couldn't figure out what. As sunset approached, the crowd grew. 500 nobles, maybe more. The most concentrated gathering of power the province had seen in years. Every family that mattered, every name that carried weight, all of them here to celebrate tradition and maintain appearances. All of them about to watch their world end. Adrian stood at the garden gates as twilight bled into night and lanterns flickered to life across the grounds. Beside him, Evelyn wore a dress the color of deep blue midnight, hair pulled back to reveal the sharp line of her jaw. She looked like someone about to walk into battle. "Last chance to back out," Adrian said. "Not a chance in hell." The moon rose full and bright, the orchestra began to play, and Adrian Blackthorne stepped forward to address the gathered nobility. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we honor tradition." The Moon Festival has been celebrated at Blackthorne Manor for generations. My father hosted this event annually. He believed in bringing people together, in maintaining connections, in preserving what came before. The crowd murmured agreement. Cedric watched from near the champagne fountain, surrounded by supporters, ready for whatever attack he thought was coming. "Tonight, I'd like to honor my father's memory by doing what he did best, revealing truths that have been hidden too long." At Adrian's signal, servants began distributing portfolios to every guest, leather-bound folders containing copies of everything. The letters, the journals, the documentation of 40 years of systematic corruption. Confusion rippled through the crowd as people opened the folders, then shock, then horror as they realized what they were reading. "These documents," Adrian continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering, detail every manipulation, every crime, every life destroyed by the network of corruption that my father helped build. Names, dates, evidence, everything needed to understand exactly how the nobility has maintained power for the past 40 years. Chaos erupted. Nobles shouting denials, others calling for guards. Cedric pushing forward through the crowd, face white with fury. But Adrian wasn't done. "Some of you are implicated directly. Others benefited indirectly. All of you participated in a system that valued power over justice. My father was the architect, but you were all willing accomplices." "You're insane," Cedric snarled. "This is slander, fabrication. None of it will—" "It's already been delivered to the authorities, to journalists, to every family that was destroyed by this conspiracy. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper in the country will be running this story. Your reputations, your positions, your power, all of it ends tonight." The crowd turned on itself. Accusations flying, alliances crumbling in real time, years of carefully maintained civility collapsing under the weight of exposed truth. And in the center of it all, Margaret Pemberton stood very still, understanding finally dawning. The information she'd fed to Cedric had been false. The real attack had been this: total exposure, every crime laid bare. No primary target because everyone was complicit. "You used me," she said quietly, though Adrian was the only one close enough to hear. "You used yourself. You chose betrayal. I just made sure it didn't matter." Her face went cold. "You've destroyed us all, including yourself." "I know. That was always the plan." Marcus Thornfield appeared at Adrian's side, along with Thomas and a dozen other families who'd been waiting for this moment. People who'd been destroyed by the system and now had documentation proving it. "The authorities are waiting at the gate," Marcus said. "Anyone who tries to flee will be arrested. Anyone who stays will be questioned. Either way, it's over. Cedric made one last desperate play. He lunged at Adrian, grabbed him by the collar. You self-righteous bastard. You think you're better than us? You think exposing this changes anything? Power doesn't disappear just because you reveal how it works. You're right, Adrian said calmly. Power doesn't disappear. It just changes hands. And I'd rather see it in the hands of people who earned it than people who inherited it through blood and brutality. Cedric swung. His fist connected with Adrian's jaw, snapping his head back. Pain exploded through his skull. But Adrian had spent 15 years learning his father's lessons, including how to fight. He drove his fist into Cedric's ribs, felt something crack, followed with a knee that doubled the other man over. They went down together, rolling across marble that suddenly ran with blood from Cedric's split lip. Guards pulled them apart. Cedric screaming threats, Adrian breathing hard, tasting copper, feeling strangely alive for the first time in years. Around them, the Moon Festival descended into anarchy, nobles being taken into custody, others fleeing. Margaret disappeared in the chaos, probably had escape routes planned, would resurface somewhere with a new identity and a new game. Evelyn pushed through the crowd to Adrian's side. You're bleeding, I'm aware. That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen, probably, but it felt good. She laughed, sharp and a little wild. The sound of someone watching the world burn and finding it beautiful. The authorities worked through the night, statements taken, evidence catalogued, arrests made. By dawn, 40 nobles were in custody with more warrants being issued. Adrian sat in what used to be his study, now effectively an interrogation room, giving testimony that implicated his own father and, by extension, himself. Everything he'd worked to preserve, the estate, the name, the position, was being systematically dismantled, and he felt nothing but relief. Thomas brought coffee as the sun rose. The old butler looked exhausted but satisfied. The garden survived, he said. Despite everything, Evelyn's roses are still blooming. Good. Let them grow wild. No more secrets. What will you do now, Your Grace? Adrian laughed bitterly. I won't be Your Grace much longer. The title will be stripped. The estate seized. I'll be lucky if I avoid prison. And then? Then I figure out who Adrian Blackthorne is when he's not defined by his father's legacy. Thomas smiled. I think you'll like that person. The old butler left him alone with his coffee and his thoughts. Outside, the moonlit garden stretched toward morning light, roses blooming, pathways clear, secrets finally exposed to sun and air. 3 days later, Evelyn found Adrian in the garden. He'd been living in the groundskeeper's cottage since the manor was seized, working alongside the few servants who'd chosen to stay despite the scandal. She sat beside him on the marble bench where he'd first caught her reading forbidden letters. The authorities want me to testify, she said, about what I found, what you planned. Tell them the truth. All of it? All of it. No more secrets, no more games, just truth and whatever consequences follow. She took his hand, scarred from garden work now, dirt permanent under her nails. Marcus offered me a position, she said. His family's estate needs restoration work. It's good money, stable. You should take it. Come with me. Adrian looked at her. Really looked. This woman who'd broken into his life and his carefully maintained isolation with equal disregard for consequences. I'm going to be convicted, he said. Maybe not of my father's crimes, but of my own complicity. The fact that I benefited, that I knew and didn't act for 15 years. That counts for something. Then I'll wait. You shouldn't have to. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm doing. You want to pay for your father's sins? Fine. Do your time. Make your amends. But when you're done, I'll be here, and we'll figure out what comes next. The certainty in her voice broke something open in Adrian's chest, something that had been locked since Catherine died, since he'd learned what his father really was, since he'd stopped believing in anything except survival. Why? He asked. After everything, after seeing what I'm capable of, why would you wait? Because you chose the hard thing. Because when the moment came, you burned your own legacy rather than maintain corruption. Because underneath all the damage your father did, there's still someone worth saving. She stood, pulled him to his feet. The garden will need tending while you're gone, she said. Someone has to make sure Margot's roses survive. Might as well be me. They walked through the moonlit garden one last time. past statues whose faces were being restored to their original features, past fountains running clear again, past roses blooming wild and free without the weight of secrets pressing down on them. Adrian had spent 15 years trying to outrun his father's shadow. Now he'd destroyed everything the old man built, exposed every crime, and accepted that he'd be paying for complicity for years to come. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done since inheriting a legacy built on lies. 2 weeks later, Adrian stood before a tribunal and pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy to conceal evidence of multiple crimes. The sentence was 7 years, reduced from 15 because of his cooperation and eventual testimony. 7 years to atone for 15 years of willful blindness. It seemed almost fair. As they led him away, he looked back once at the courtroom gallery. Evelyn sat in the front row, dirt still visible under her nails, expression fierce and uncompromising. She'd be there when he got out, would wait while he did his time, paid his debts, figured out who he was without the armor of nobility and inherited power. And then, if there was any justice left in the world, they'd build something new, something that didn't require secrets or shadows or the systematic destruction of anyone who got in the way. Something honest. The prison doors closed behind him with metallic finality. 7 years. 2,555 days. Adrian Blackthorne, former Duke, destroyer of his own legacy, had finally learned his father's last lesson. Power built on suffering always collapses eventually. The only choice was whether you brought it down yourself or waited for it to bury you. He'd chosen. And for the first time in 15 years, his conscience was clean. Prison changed a man. Not in the ways people imagined. No dramatic transformations, no sudden enlightenment. Just the slow erosion of everything unnecessary until only the core remained. Adrian spent his first year learning that lesson. Learning to sleep through sounds that would have woken him screaming in his former life. Learning to eat food that tasted like cardboard and gratitude. Learning that a duke's training in navigating hostile social structures translated surprisingly well to surviving among men who had nothing left to lose. The other inmates tested him early. A fight in the yard 3 weeks in, 5 men who thought the fallen nobleman would be easy prey. Adrian put 2 in the infirmary and earned enough respect to be left alone after that. His father's lessons again. Violence applied precisely was more effective than violence applied brutally. But it was the quiet that really unmade him. Hours alone in a cell barely wide enough to pace. No servants, no estate business, no distractions from the accumulated weight of 15 years spent maintaining a system he'd known was rotten. Just him and his conscience and a lot of time to think about what that made him. Evelyn visited every month. Always on the 15th, always for exactly 1 hour, always with dirt still visible under her nails from whatever garden she'd been restoring. She'd tell him about the work, Marcus Thornfield's estate, then the Pemberton grounds after Margaret disappeared, then a dozen other projects for families who wanted to rebuild something beautiful from scandal's wreckage. She never asked when he was getting out, never made promises about what came after, just sat across from him in a room designed to strip away privacy and talked about roses like they were the only thing that mattered. Maybe they were. On the 2-year anniversary of his sentencing, she brought news that made his chest tighten. Cedric's been released. Good behavior and family connections. He's rebuilding his network. Adrian's hands clenched on the metal table between them. How bad. Bad. He's positioning himself as the victim of your vendetta, claiming you fabricated evidence to destroy innocent families. Some people are listening. Because people wanted to listen. Wanted to believe the old order could be restored. That the scandal had been exaggeration. That everything could go back to normal if they just ignored the truth loudly enough. What about the evidence? Still valid, still documented, but memory fades faster than paper burns. Another few years and half the province will have convinced themselves none of it was that serious. Adrian had known this was possible, had understood that exposing corruption didn't automatically dismantle it, but hearing confirmation still felt like swallowing glass. "And you?" he asked. "Are you safe?" Evelyn's smile was sharp. "I keep a knife in my boot and I know how to use it, and Marcus has guards at the estate. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. I'm as safe as anyone can be in a world where men like Cedric Ashbourne exist, which is to say not very. But I'm not hiding." She never did. That was the thing about Evelyn Vale. She walked into fire like it was rain and somehow made you believe she'd walk out the other side. 5 more years, Adrian said. That's when I'm eligible for early release. Can you wait that long? I've already waited 2. 5 more won't kill me. Probably. The guard called time. Evelyn stood, pressed her palm flat against the glass partition between them. Adrian matched the gesture, feeling nothing but barrier and distance and the aching certainty that he'd dragged someone brilliant into his family's wreckage. I'll see you on the 15th, she said. Then she was gone, and Adrian was alone with the knowledge that somewhere outside these walls, Cedric Ashbourne was rebuilding everything they'd destroyed. 3 years became 4. 4 became 5. Adrian kept his head down, served his time, watched the calendar tick toward freedom with the kind of patience prison taught efficiently. But something was building. He could feel it in the letters that stopped coming from Thomas, in the way Evelyn's visits grew briefer, more tense, in the careful way she avoided mentioning certain topics. Something was wrong. 2 months before his scheduled release, everything broke. Marcus Thornfield arrived instead of Evelyn. The man looked like he'd aged a decade in 5 years. Gray hair, lines carved deep, eyes that had seen too much violence. Adrian knew before Marcus spoke. Knew the way you know a storm's coming before the first drop falls. Evelyn's been taken. The world stopped. Sound disappeared. Adrian's vision tunneled until all he could see was Marcus's mouth moving, words filtering through like they were traveling underwater. Cedric's people grabbed her 3 days ago. Left a message. You want her back? You give him the master documentation, everything your father collected. The original files that prove the conspiracy. I don't have them. They were seized when I was convicted. Cedric doesn't believe that. Thinks you hid copies. Thinks you kept leverage in case you needed it. Adrian's mind raced. The documentation was gone, turned over to authorities, distributed to journalists, made public. But Cedric was right about one thing. Adrian's father had been too paranoid to keep only one set of records. There were backups. Hidden so deep even Adrian had only found them by accident during his final weeks at the estate. Documents his father had kept separate. Insurance against his allies turning on him. Proof of crimes even worse than what had been exposed. Evidence that would destroy everyone. Not just the nobles who'd collaborated. Everyone. Including families who'd been victims. Including the authorities who'd covered up inconvenient truths. Including the new government trying to rebuild from the scandal's ashes. It was the kind of leverage that could reshape the entire power structure. Or collapse it completely. Where's the exchange? Adrian asked. Blackthorn Manor. The Moonlit Garden. 3 days from now, at midnight. I'm in prison. How am I supposed to... Marcus slid a folded paper across the table. Already arranged. You're being transferred to a facility closer to the capital tomorrow. Transport route goes past the Thornfield estate. There'll be an accident. Guards will survive. You won't be in the vehicle. You're helping me escape. I'm helping you save the woman who spent 5 years keeping your garden alive while you paid your debts. After that, what you do is your business. Adrian looked at the paper. At the plan Marcus had risked everything to arrange. At the chance to undo 5 years of careful penance with one illegal action. If I do this, I'm a fugitive. Everything I sacrificed, the conviction, the time served, the attempt at atonement, it's all wasted. Your atonement means nothing if Cedric kills her. And he will. The moment he realizes you don't have what he wants, he'll make an example of her. Why? Why does he care this much after 5 years? Because you humiliated him, exposed him as a fraud and a criminal in front of everyone who mattered. Men like Cedric don't forgive that. They just wait for the right moment to return the favor. And this is his moment. Yes. The guard's footsteps approached. Marcus stood. 1 minute to decide. After that, the plan moves forward with or without your cooperation. Adrian thought about Evelyn, about dirt under her fingernails and fierce conviction in her eyes, about 5 years of monthly visits and patient waiting, about someone who'd looked at him at his absolute worst and decided he was worth the trouble, about what his father would have done. The old man would have calculated, weighed costs and benefits, decided whether one person's life was worth risking the larger objective. But Adrian had spent 5 years learning to be something other than his father's son. I'm in, he said. The transport accident happened exactly as planned. The vehicle rolled, guards evacuated. In the chaos, Adrian disappeared into woods that bordered the Thornfield estate. Marcus waited with clothes, money, and a revolver that felt wrong in Adrian's hand after 5 years without weapons. "The master documentation," Marcus said. "Where is it?" "Hidden in the garden. My father built a vault under the main fountain, triple locked, only accessible during a new moon when the water level drops low enough to reveal the entrance. And tonight? Full moon. Opposite of what we need. But there's a manual override, requires 2 keys. My father kept one. His closest ally kept the other." "Who was the ally?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Lord Pemberton. Margaret's last husband. The one who died mysteriously before she inherited everything." "Yes. Which means Margaret probably has the key." Marcus cursed. "She disappeared after the scandal broke. No one's seen her in 5 years. Then we find her. We have 3 days. They found her in 2. Margaret Pemberton, now going by Margaret Stone, had resurfaced in a coastal city 300 miles away. New name, new face, courtesy of subtle surgery, new life built on money she'd hidden before everything collapsed. She was smarter than Adrian had given her credit for. Smart enough to recognize him despite 5 years in prison's changes the moment he walked into her villa. She didn't run, didn't scream, just poured 3 glasses of wine and gestured for him and Marcus to sit. "You look terrible, darling." Prison agrees with no one. "I need the key," Adrian said. "Pemberton's key to the garden vault." Margaret sipped her wine. "And why would I give you that?" "Because Cedric has Evelyn. Because he'll kill her if I don't deliver the master documentation. Because despite everything, you're not actually a murderer." "No. But I am a survivor, and giving you that key puts me directly in Cedric's crosshairs. He'll know I helped you. He'll come for me next. He'll come for you anyway. You betrayed him 5 years ago when you fed him false information that made him look like a fool. Men like Cedric keep lists. You're already on it." Her expression flickered. Fear. Just a flash before the mask reasserted itself. "Even if I wanted to help, the key's not here. I buried it with Pemberton, sentimental fool that I was." "Where?" "Ravencroft Cemetery, family crypt, 3rd shelf from the bottom behind his ashes." Adrian stood. "Thank you." "Don't. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because that girl, Evelyn, she helped restore my gardens after I lost everything. She didn't have to. Could have walked away. Didn't. That kind of decency is rare enough to be worth protecting." She pulled a sealed envelope from her desk. "This is everything I know about Cedric's current operation. Locations, allies, weaknesses. Use it wisely. Why help at all? After what happened?" Margaret's smile was sad. "Because I'm tired, Adrian. Tired of running, tired of playing games, tired of being the woman who survives by sacrificing everyone else. Maybe it's time to try something different." They retrieved the key from Pemberton's crypt at dawn. By noon, they were heading back toward Blackthorn Manor and a confrontation 5 years in the making. The estate looked different. Partially restored by the government, sold to cover debts, resold to investors who'd turned it into something between museum and cautionary tale. Tours ran during the day. The Moonlit garden had been sealed, too controversial, too connected to scandal. But Adrian knew ways in that no tour guide would ever find. Passages his father had built for emergencies. Routes designed for secrets and necessary disappearances. They entered at dusk. Adrian, Marcus, and 4 men Marcus had hired. Former soldiers, loyal to coin and principle in that order. Not enough to fight an army, but enough to make Cedric think twice about betrayal. The garden was overgrown again. 5 years of neglect had undone much of Evelyn's restoration work. Roses climbed wild over pathways. Fountains sat cracked and dry. The statues watched with moss-covered faces. It looked like the garden remembered what it had been built for, like it was reverting to type, a place for secrets, for buried sins, for the kind of transactions that required darkness. They reached the central fountain as the moon rose. Adrian had the keys. Marcus had weapons ready. The hired soldiers took positions around the perimeter, and they waited. Cedric arrived at midnight exactly. Dramatic timing. The man had always had a flair for theater. He came with 20 men. Professional, armed. The kind of security that said he'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years. And in the center of it all, hands bound, mouth gagged, was Evelyn. She looked wrong, thinner, bruised, but her eyes were still fierce, still burning with the kind of anger that kept people alive through situations that should have killed them. Adrian's vision went red. Every instinct his father had trained into him screamed for violence, for taking Cedric apart piece by piece until nothing remained but regret and blood. But he'd learned control. 5 years of prison had taught him the difference between wanting violence and choosing it. Cedric smiled. Adrian, you look well. Incarceration must suit you. Let her go. Show me the documentation first. Adrian held up the keys. In the vault, under this fountain. But you don't get access until she's safely out of this garden. Cedric's smile widened. You're not in a position to negotiate. I have 20 guns pointed at you right now. You have, what, 4 men? 5, including Marcus? The math doesn't work in your favor. The math never does. But I've learned something in the last 5 years. Power isn't about numbers. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to get what you want. And what are you willing to sacrifice? Everything. Adrian pulled a lever hidden in the fountain's base. The mechanism groaned. Water that had been stagnant for years began to drain, and as it drained, something became visible in the fountain's depths. Not a vault, a bomb. Large enough to level the entire garden, old enough to be his father's final insurance policy, and wired to detonate if anyone except someone with very specific knowledge tried to access the vault below. Cedric's expression shifted. Calculation replacing confidence. You're bluffing. You wouldn't destroy the only leverage you have. I'm not bluffing. And it's not leverage. It's evidence. It was always meant to go public eventually. The only question is whether it goes public through controlled release or through pieces of us scattered across this garden. The hired soldiers shifted nervously. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. Cedric's men looked to him for direction. And Evelyn? Evelyn made a sound behind her gag that might have been laughter. Of course she'd find this funny. They were standing on a bomb negotiating for documentation that could destroy an empire, and she was laughing. New terms, Adrian said. You let her go. She walks out of this garden safely. Then you and I, just us, we go down into that vault together. We retrieve the documentation, and we decide together what happens to it. Why would I trust you? Because you don't have a choice. You kill us. The bomb detonates. You try to leave without the documentation, I detonate it manually. You shoot me, Marcus detonates it. The only way any of us survive this is cooperation. Cedric's jaw tightened. He'd been outmaneuvered, backed into a corner where violence wouldn't solve the problem, where the only path forward required trusting the man he'd spent 5 years planning to destroy. People said desperation made humans dangerous. They were wrong. What made humans truly dangerous was the moment when they stopped caring about survival and started caring only about principle. The moment when dying for something mattered more than living for nothing. Adrian had reached that moment the instant he'd seen Evelyn bound and bruised. Everything else, freedom, redemption, his carefully rebuilt life, all of it was negotiable. But her life? That was the line. The place where compromise ended and consequence began. Cedric seemed to recognize it, to understand that he was facing someone who'd already accepted the worst outcome and made peace with it. Fine, Cedric said. She goes free. But if this is a trap, it's not a trap. It's an ending. One way or another, this ends tonight. Cedric gestured. One of his men cut Evelyn's bonds. She pulled the gag from her mouth, stumbled forward on legs that had been immobile too long. Adrian caught her. For just a moment, one heartbeat, he let himself hold her. Feel her breathing, confirm she was real and alive and still impossibly stubborn. You came, she whispered. Of course I came. You're supposed to be in prison. You're throwing away everything I'm saving you. That's all that matters. She pulled back enough to look at him. Her hand came up to his face. 5 years of changes between them. 5 years of waiting and distance and careful hope that maybe they'd get another chance. Don't die, she said. That's not a request. It's an order. I'll do my best. Marcus took her arm. Come on, let's get you out of here. She went reluctantly, kept looking back as Marcus led her toward the garden gates, and Adrian watched her go knowing there was a solid chance he'd never see her again. Worth it. Completely worth it. When the gates closed behind Evelyn and Marcus, Cedric and Adrian were left facing each other across the drained fountain, 20 armed men in a semicircle, the bomb ticking below, the moon overhead like a spotlight on judgment. "Well then," Cedric said, "shall we see what your father left us?" Together they descended into the vault, stone steps worn smooth by decades of secret visits. The air smelled like rust and old paper, and the particular decay of things kept too long in darkness. The vault was exactly as Adrian remembered: wall-to-wall filing cabinets, shelves stacked with journals, boxes containing enough evidence to destroy every powerful family in the province twice over. His father's legacy, preserved, waiting. Cedric's eyes went wide. This is everything. Everything and more. 40 years of documentation, crimes, conspiracies. Proof of things that would make what we exposed 5 years ago look like minor infractions. Cedric moved between the shelves, pulling out random files, scanning contents with growing horror and excitement. This could rebuild everything. With this kind of leverage, we could what? Adrian interrupted. Blackmail our way back into power? Restore the exact system we just spent 5 years pretending to dismantle? Why not? The alternative is chaos. At least with this, we can maintain order, control the damage. That's what my father thought, that control mattered more than justice, that maintaining order justified any means necessary. Your father was right. Look what happened when we exposed the truth. Scandal, collapse, violence. The province still hasn't recovered. People died in the power vacuum. Was that better? It was honest. Honest doesn't feed people, doesn't keep them safe, doesn't build anything. It just tears down and calls it progress. Adrian pulled out a specific file, the one he'd been looking for, the one his father had kept separate from everything else. There's one more thing you should see. He opened it. Inside were documents Cedric had never known existed. Proof that his father, the great Lord Ashbourne, had actually orchestrated William Thorne's execution, not for political gain, but to cover up his own embezzlement from the crown treasury. That everything afterward, the conspiracy, the alliances, the careful power building, had been designed to hide one man's theft. Cedric's family legacy wasn't built on strength. It was built on a lie wrapped around a crime wrapped around desperation. Cedric read. His face went white, then red, then something beyond rage. You're lying. This is fabricated. My father fabricated many things. Evidence wasn't one of them. He was too paranoid, needed to know he could destroy anyone if necessary, including his allies. Why are you showing me this? Because you need to understand what you're fighting for. Your father's legacy is as poisoned as mine. The system we're arguing about? It was rotten from the start, built by desperate men making terrible choices and calling it necessity. So what? We burn it all? Destroy everything and hope something better grows from ashes? Yes. Cedric laughed, bitter, broken. You're insane. You spent 5 years in prison and came out believing in fairy tales. I came out believing in the possibility that we could be better than what came before. That's not a fairy tale. It's a choice. Above them, footsteps, multiple boots on stone, Cedric's men coming down to check on their employer, or Marcus's people moving into position, or authorities finally responding to reports of armed men at the estate. Time was running out, the moment crystallizing into something irreversible. Cedric's hand moved toward his gun. Adrian tensed. And somewhere above them, in the garden where roses bloomed wild over buried sins, Evelyn Vale stood at the gates, refusing to leave despite Marcus's urgent whispers. Watching. Waiting. Betting everything on the belief that Adrian Blackthorne would walk out alive. That hope was about to be tested against reality. The vault waited. The documentation sat between them, enough power to reshape everything or destroy it completely. And two men who'd inherited impossible legacies prepared to make the kind of choice that defined what came after. The bomb's timer ticked down. 3 minutes until detonation, and the only people who could stop it stood facing each other in darkness, deciding whether salvation required sacrifice or if mercy could coexist with justice. The answer would determine everything. For them. For Evelyn. For every family whose lives had been shattered by the system they were fighting over. Cedric's finger tightened on the trigger. Adrian's hand moved toward the detonator. The footsteps above grew louder, and the moment balanced on a knife edge between catastrophe and redemption. The gun in Cedric's hand trembled, not from fear, from rage so pure it had nowhere else to go. Above them, boots hammered against stone, voices shouting commands that echoed down into the vault, where two men stood surrounded by 40 years of accumulated sins. Adrian's thumb rested on the detonator. 3 minutes. Maybe less. Time had stopped meaning anything beyond the choice crystallizing between them. "You'd really do it," Cedric said. "You'd blow us both to hell rather than let me walk out with this." "I'd blow us all to hell rather than let this cycle continue. My father built an empire on suffering. Your father maintained it. We inherited the consequences and called it legacy. That ends tonight, one way or another." The footsteps were closer now, seconds away from descending. Cedric's finger tightened on the trigger. His eyes were wild with something beyond calculation, the desperate fury of a man watching his last chance at redemption slip away. Because that's what the documentation represented to him. Not just power, not just leverage, but proof that he could be something more than his father's failed legacy. That he could rebuild what had been destroyed and call it justice. Adrian understood. He'd felt the same pull 5 years ago. The seductive whisper that maybe violence in service of order was acceptable. That maybe the ends could justify any means if you just believed hard enough. But he'd learned something in prison that Cedric never would. Some prices were too high. Some methods poisoned whatever they built. And legacy measured by power was just another word for inherited trauma. The vault door burst open. Light flooded down. Voices shouting, "Drop your weapons! Hands where we can see them! Authorities!" Finally. Marcus must have contacted them the moment Evelyn was clear. Cedric's choice narrowed to nothing. Shoot Adrian and die in the explosion. Surrender and lose everything. Run and get gunned down by the armed men pouring into the vault. Adrian watched recognition dawn in the other man's eyes. The moment when someone realizes they've lost, not because they were outplayed, but because they never understood the game. "You were never going to let me have it," Cedric said quietly. "The documentation, the power, any of it. This was always about destroying everything." "No. This was always about choosing what we build from the rubble. I'm just done letting men like our fathers make that choice for us." Adrian released the detonator, raised his hands, let the authorities swarm in and separate them. Cedric stood frozen, gun hanging loose, looking at the filing cabinets full of evidence he'd never possess, at the power that had been within reach and was now dissolving like smoke. Then he smiled, bitter, broken, almost peaceful. "We deserved better than them," he said. "Better than fathers who made us weapons before we learned to be men." "Yeah, we did." The authorities took Cedric first, hands behind his back, rights being read. He went without resistance. Just looked back once at Adrian with an expression that might have been respect or might have been pity. Hard to tell the difference when you'd both lost everything. They took Adrian next. Escape charges, violation of parole, whatever else they could stack on. He didn't fight, didn't argue, just let them lead him up out of the vault into moonlight that felt like being reborn. The garden was full of law enforcement, crime scene investigators, officials cataloging evidence, the organized chaos of a system trying to reassert control over something that had slipped free for too long. And standing at the gates, refusing to leave despite multiple orders, was Evelyn. She looked wrecked, bruises blooming purple across her cheekbone, wrists raw from bindings, but her eyes were clear and fierce and locked on him with an intensity that made his chest ache. The officer holding Adrian's arm tried to steer him away. Adrian planted his feet. 5 minutes. Just give me 5 minutes. The officer looked at his supervisor. Some silent communication, then a curt nod. 5 minutes. Then you're in custody. They let him walk to the gates. Let Evelyn meet him halfway. Let them have a moment in a garden that had seen too much tragedy and not nearly enough grace. "You're an idiot," she said. "I know. You threw away 5 years of good behavior. Early release. Everything. I know. For me. Always for you." Her hand came up to his face, traced the new lines prison and desperation had carved there. He'd aged. They both had. 5 years of distance and careful hope, and now this. Another separation, another consequence of choices made in fire. "How long?" she asked. "Years, maybe decades. I'll be old when I get out. Gray. Probably bitter. I can work with bitter. I've been practicing on roses for 5 years. Thorns don't scare me." Adrian laughed. Raw. Almost painful. "You should walk away. Find someone who isn't carrying generational trauma and a criminal record. Someone stable. Stability is overrated. Besides, I've already invested 5 years. That's sunk cost. Economics says I should see it through. That's not how sunk cost works. I'm a gardener, not an economist. I'll interpret it however I want. The officer cleared his throat. Time's up. Evelyn's grip on Adrian's face tightened. Listen to me. You did the right thing, not the legal thing, not the safe thing, but the right thing. That counts. Does it? I destroyed evidence, helped a fugitive, violated every term of my release. That's not righteousness. That's just love. That's love. And love doesn't calculate consequences before acting. It just acts and deals with the fallout. Her words hit like absolution he didn't deserve. He'd spent 5 years trying to atone for his father's sins by being better, by following rules, by accepting punishment. And the moment those rules conflicted with saving her, he'd thrown it all away without hesitation. Maybe that made him a criminal, or maybe it made him human. Hard to tell which was worse. The officer's hand closed on Adrian's arm. Firm. Time to go. Evelyn leaned in, pressed her forehead to his, breathed the same air for one heartbeat. I'll be here when you get out, she whispered. However long it takes, I'll be in the garden. Waiting. You can't promise that. You don't know. I'm promising it anyway, because some things are worth waiting for. You taught me that. 5 years ago when you chose truth over safety, when you burned your legacy rather than maintain corruption. That's the man I'm waiting for. Not the Duke, not the title, just you. They pulled him away, led him to the transport vehicle. Adrian looked back once and saw Evelyn standing in moonlight looking exactly like the night they'd met, dirt on her clothes, defiance in her eyes, refusing to acknowledge that the world might be bigger than her conviction. The garden stretched behind her, wild roses climbing over marble, fountains cracked but still beautiful, a place built for secrets that had finally learned to speak truth. Adrian climbed into the vehicle. The door closed. Through the window, he watched the estate disappear. Blackthorn Manor and its moonlit garden, the place where his father's empire had been built and destroyed, where he'd learned what power cost and what it was worth. The place he'd probably never see again. But as they drove through darkness toward whatever prison would hold him, Adrian felt something unexpected. Peace. The kind that came not from winning, but from choosing right action over safe outcome. From understanding that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in maintaining control, but in letting it go. His father had built an empire by holding tight to every advantage. Adrian was dismantling it by opening his hands. Maybe that was the legacy that mattered. Not what you accumulated, but what you were willing to release. The trial took 3 months. Adrian was charged with escape, evidence tampering, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The prosecution wanted 15 years. His lawyer argued mitigating circumstances. He'd saved a life, prevented Cedric from weaponizing dangerous information, ultimately cooperated with authorities. The judge listened, deliberated, sentenced him to 8 years with possibility of parole after 5. Less than he'd feared, more than he'd hoped. He served them at a maximum security facility 600 miles from Blackthorn Manor. Harder than the first prison, more violent. The kind of place that reminded you daily that society had decided you didn't deserve softness. But Adrian had learned how to survive, how to navigate, how to find the quiet spaces between violence where a man could think and plan and remember why he'd chosen this path. Evelyn visited when she could. Not monthly anymore. Distance and expense made that impossible. But 3 or 4 times a year she'd make the trip, always with dirt under her nails, always with stories about gardens she was restoring. She never talked about waiting, never made promises about after, just sat across from him and talked about roses like they were the most important thing in the world. Maybe they were. Maybe beauty persisting despite neglect was the whole point. Marcus visited too, less frequently but with purpose. Updates on the province, on families rebuilding from scandal, on the slow work of creating systems that didn't require brutality to function. Change was happening, glacial, painful, but real. New faces in government, new rules about accountability. The documentation from the vault had been made public, all of it, no exceptions. And yes, it had caused chaos, but chaos eventually settled, and what remained was something that looked almost like justice. Thomas sent letters, monthly, without fail. Updates on the estate. It had been purchased by a collective of families who'd been victimized by the old system. They were turning it into something else. A school, maybe. or a center for restorative justice, something that acknowledged history without being imprisoned by it. The Moonlit Garden was being maintained by a team of volunteers, led by Evelyn when she was in the area. The roses thrived, the fountains had been repaired, the statues' faces restored to their original features, no longer anonymous victims but remembered people with names and stories. Margot Blackthorne had a plaque now. So did William Thorne. So did Catherine Thornfield. So did dozens of others whose lives had been destroyed in service of power. The garden was becoming what it should have been from the start, a memorial. Not to hide tragedy, but to honor it. To say we see what happened here and we choose different. 5 years became 6, 6 became 7. Adrian earned parole eligibility through good behavior and education programs. He took classes, got certified in mediation and conflict resolution, learned skills for a world that didn't include inherited power or noble titles, learned to be someone other than a duke's son. The parole hearing was brief. The board reviewed his record, his cooperation, the changes he'd made, the letters of support from Marcus, Thomas, Evelyn, and surprisingly, Margaret, who'd resurfaced long enough to testify that Adrian Blackthorne had chosen conscience over convenience and deserved a second chance. Parole granted. Effective immediately. Adrian walked out of prison at 47 years old, gray at the temples, lines etched deep around his eyes, scars from fights he'd had to win to survive, but alive, free, and for the first time in his entire life, unencumbered by legacy. He had nothing, no title, no estate, no inherited fortune, just a small bag of possessions and a bus ticket to Ravencroft. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like possibility. The bus ride took 18 hours. Adrian watched countryside roll past and thought about his father, about the man who'd built an empire and called it success, who died believing power was the only currency that mattered. The old man had been wrong about almost everything, but he'd been right about one thing. The world was brutal. Survival required strategy. Peace required strength. Adrian had learned those lessons, had become fluent in his father's language of calculated violence and controlled manipulation. But he'd also learned something the old man never had. There were different kinds of strength, different strategies, different ways to survive that didn't require destroying everyone in your path. You could build without tearing down, could create space for others instead of taking it for yourself, could be powerful without being poisonous. It was harder, slower, required patience his father never possessed, but it was possible, and possibility was enough. The bus pulled into Ravencroft at sunset. Adrian stepped off into a town that had changed substantially since he'd last seen it, less ostentatious, more functional, the kind of place that had learned to value substance over spectacle. He walked through streets where people no longer recognized him, where he was just another middle-aged man in worn clothes carrying everything he owned, anonymous, invisible, exactly what he needed to be. Blackthorne Manor appeared over the hill at dusk. The building had been repainted, gardens expanded, signs indicated it was now the Thornfield Institute for Restorative Justice, named after Catherine, funded by Marcus, dedicated to healing the kinds of wounds the old system had caused. Adrian stood at the gates for a long moment. This place had been his prison long before any cell. The weight of expectation, of inherited sin, of trying to be something impossible. Now it belonged to everyone, and somehow that felt right. He found the Moonlit Garden by memory. The gates stood open now, no more locks, no more secrets, just an invitation to witness beauty grown from tragedy. The roses were magnificent, 10 years of Evelyn's work evident in every carefully tended bed, colors blooming in the fading light, pathways clear, fountains running, the statues standing clean and named, and in the center of it all, kneeling in the dirt, transplanting a section of white climbing roses, was Evelyn Vale. She'd aged 2. Lines around her eyes from squinting at plants in sunlight, gray threading through her hair, hands permanently stained with soil and work. 42 years old and somehow more beautiful than his memory had allowed. She must have sensed him, looked up, trowel freezing mid-motion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Just looked at each other across 10 years of distance and consequence and patient faith that this moment might actually arrive. Then Evelyn stood, brushed dirt from her knees, walked over with the same confident stride that had carried her through a decade of waiting. She stopped 3 feet away, studying him, taking inventory of changes. You look old, she said finally. I am old. Prison ages you. Good. I was worried you'd come out looking distinguished. That would have been annoying. Adrian laughed. Actual laughter. The sound shocked him. He'd forgotten what it felt like. You waited. I told you I would. 10 years. You could have done anything, gone anywhere. Built a whole life. I did build a life. Here, in this garden. Restoring what your father tried to destroy. That's a life worth living. She closed the distance between them, reached up to trace the gray at his temples, the scars on his knuckles, the evidence of time and consequence written on his body. I like you better this way, she said, without the title, without the armor, just Adrian. Just Adrian doesn't have anything to offer. No wealth, no position, just baggage and a parole officer. Evelyn smiled. Just Adrian is exactly what I've been waiting for. The man who chose right over easy, who burned his legacy rather than compromise his conscience, who learned that strength isn't about control, it's about knowing when to let go. Her hands framed his face. He covered them with his own, rough skin against rough skin. Two people who'd spent a decade doing hard work learning hard lessons. I don't know how to do this, Adrian admitted. Normal life. Ordinary relationship. I was trained for empire building and political warfare. Not gardening and growing old together? Yeah. Lucky for you, I'm an excellent teacher. We'll start simple. Roses. Then we'll work our way up to complicated things like trust and partnership and figuring out what normal means when neither of us has ever experienced it. That could take years. Good thing we have time then. She kissed him, soft, careful, like something precious that had survived against impossible odds and deserved gentle treatment. Adrian kissed back, tasting dirt and possibility and the strange sweetness of starting over from nothing. When they pulled apart, the moon was rising over the garden, full and bright, painting everything silver. Come on, Evelyn said. I want to show you something. She led him through pathways he'd walked a lifetime ago. Past fountains he remembered empty and cracked. Past statues that had been faceless and were now named. The garden had transformed. What had been a monument to secrets had become something else, a place that acknowledged darkness without being defined by it. They stopped at the oldest rose bed, the one where Margot Blackthorne had planted white roses before taking her own life, the one where Adrian had first discovered his father's sins buried beneath beauty. Evelyn knelt, gestured for Adrian to join her. Every year on the anniversary of Margot's death, we plant a new rose, she said. White ones. In her memory. So she's not just remembered as a victim, but as someone who created beauty even when the world was determined to destroy her. How many roses? 10 so far. One for each year since you exposed what happened. Adrian looked at the bed. At a decade of roses growing strong. At proof that remembering trauma didn't have to mean staying trapped in it. Who tends them? He asked. Volunteers mostly. But I do the planting. Every year on the same night. Usually alone. Not this year. No. Not this year. She pulled 2 young rose plants from her bag, white, healthy, ready to take root. Together they dug, prepared the soil, planted side by side in dirt that had absorbed too much sorrow and was learning to grow beauty instead. As they worked, Evelyn talked. About the families who visited the garden now, about children who came to learn history and plant seeds, about how trauma acknowledged could eventually become trauma transcended. About how the garden was teaching her what Adrian's journey had taught him, that the greatest strength wasn't in maintaining power but in creating space for something new. They finished planting as midnight approached, packed down soil, watered thoroughly, sat back to admire work that would take years to fully bloom but was already beautiful in potential. Thank you, Adrian said quietly. For what? For waiting, for believing. For seeing something in me worth the trouble when I couldn't see it myself. Evelyn leaned against him. Solid, warm, real. You did the hard part. I just kept the garden alive while you figured yourself out. They sat in comfortable silence as the moon climbed higher. Around them, roses bloomed in moonlight, white and red and pink and yellow. A riot of color grown from tragedy. Proof that beauty could survive if someone cared enough to tend it. Adrian thought about his father. About the man who'd built an empire on suffering and died believing he'd won. about legacy measured in power instead of principle. The old man had been convinced that control was the only path to survival, that manipulation was necessary, that some people were born to rule and others to be ruled. He'd been wrong. Spectacularly. Absolutely. Wrong. Real power wasn't about domination. It was about choosing who you became under pressure. It was about standing in the ruins of everything you'd inherited and deciding what deserved to be rebuilt and what deserved to stay buried. It was about looking at a garden full of ghosts and planting roses anyway, about trusting that beauty mattered even when the world insisted only strength survived, about believing that people could change if they were willing to do the work. Adrian had spent half his life trying to escape his father's shadow, the other half trying to dismantle what the old man had built. And now he was finally free to build something entirely his own, something small, something honest, something that didn't require anyone else's suffering to exist. A life with a woman who'd waited a decade for him to figure out what mattered. A purpose that involved dirt and patience and the slow work of making things grow. A legacy measured not in power accumulated, but in beauty preserved. It wasn't glamorous. Wasn't impressive by the standards he'd been raised with, but it was his, and that made it everything. "What do we do now?" he asked. Evelyn smiled. "Now we tend the garden. We plant more roses. We show people that trauma doesn't have to define them. We build something worth preserving. And us? We figure it out one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who've earned the right to be ordinary together. I don't know if I remember how to be ordinary. Then we'll learn together. I'm not entirely sure I know how either, but I'm willing to try if you are." Adrian looked at the garden stretching into moonlight, at a decade of restoration work evident in every carefully tended bed, at proof that something broken could become beautiful if given time and attention, and someone who refused to give up on it. He thought about Catherine, about Margot, about William Thorne, and all the others whose lives had been destroyed by the system his father built, about the years he'd spent maintaining that system before finally finding the courage to burn it down, about the price paid, the consequences accepted, the long road from Duke to convict to simply Adrian. It had cost everything, his title, his freedom, years of his life spent in cells learning lessons he should have understood decades earlier. But he'd learned them, had become something different, something better, not perfect, not redeemed, just different. And different was enough. "I'm willing to try," he said. Evelyn took his hand, squeezed once, then stood and pulled him to his feet. "Come on, I have a cottage on the edge of the estate. Nothing fancy. But it has a garden that needs work and a kitchen table that seats two. We can start there." They walked out of the moonlit garden as dawn approached. Behind them, roses bloomed in moonlight and memory. Ahead, an ordinary life waited, full of dirt and work and the slow accumulation of peaceful days. No empire, no power, no legacy except what they built together from nothing. For the first time in 47 years, Adrian Blackthorne was exactly where he wanted to be. And the moonlit garden, the place where secrets had died and truth had taken root, stood open to moonlight and morning sun. A monument not to what had been lost, but to what had survived. To beauty grown from ash. To love that waited through consequence. To the possibility that even the most poisoned legacy could eventually become soil for something new. The roses would keep blooming. The garden would keep growing. And two people who'd earned the right to ordinary joy would tend it together until age or death, or grace, finally claimed them. That was legacy enough. That was everything. And under the moonlight that had witnessed generations of tragedy, Blackthorne Manor's garden finally became what it should have been from the start, a place where hope wasn't hidden. It was planted, tended, allowed to grow wild and free and magnificent. And that was worth every sacrifice, every consequence, every long year spent learning that strength wasn't about control. It was about choosing, again and again, to plant beauty in darkness and trust that morning would eventually come. It always did. And when it came, the roses were waiting.